This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
One of the reasons I really love hospice is because everywhere else you go, the doctor is the top of the team and everything flows from there. In hospice, we are all really equals, in my opinion. And so what that social worker is doing when they come in and they ease a family suffering or help them plan where a patient is going to spend their last days, or when the CNA comes in and gives a bath, or when the nurse comes in and gets the comfort kit ready. I mean, the roles we all play equally affect people's lives.
This is the Heart of Hospice podcast with Helen Bauer. Hospice physician and podcaster Jordan Grummett is here today, sharing how his work creates deep conversations about money and life. Whether you're a family caregiver or an end-of-life professional, the Heart of Hospice is here to enhance your hospice experience by connecting you with information you can use about end-of-life care. My guest today is Dr. Jordan Grummett. He's a fellow podcaster, made his interview so easy. One podcaster to another, so we just chatted up everything, all hospice, and we talked about money, which seems an odd blending, but when you hear the interview, you're going to get it completely. Jordan Grummett is an associate medical director at Journey Care Hospice. After 15 years of blogging about financial independence and wellness, he launched the Earn and Invest podcast. In 2019, the podcast received the Plutus Award for Best New Personal Finance Podcast and was nominated in 2020 for Best Personal Finance Podcast of the Year. I have to say, I am not a fan of the financial information world. I find it overwhelming. Math isn't my favorite subject. I leave that to other family members to manage for me because I'm lazy and I don't like it. But talking to Jordan, interesting viewpoint. What do we need for quality of life financially at the end of life? It's conversation that we should be having when we are much younger, in our 20s, when we're starting out. We think a lot about building wealth and what do we want to do now. But as Jordan will tell you, these are conversations that we should project way into our future towards the end of life. And he's got some great perspective as a hospice physician, some great experience that he's going to share. I love the way he talks about hospice aides. Wonderful, wonderful. And you're going to hear all that. So, as a special bonus, we are going to be giving away copies of Jordan's book, his new book called Taking Stock. And all you have to do, listen to the end of the podcast, and you will hear how you can get one of those books for yourself. We'll send it right to your door. So here's my interview with Dr. Jordan Grummett. Jordan, I'm so glad to have you on the Heart of Hospice podcast. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
It's great to have another podcaster because we sort of speak the same podcasting language, and it's kind of fun to see, compare equipment and compare processes. I like that. I get to hear about your process in your podcast.
Yeah, we're like our own little group. We have our own language. We have our own experiences. Similar to what I say about people who are in hospice. We also have kind of our own group and our own experiences and our own catchphrases. So it's nice to be part of a group, or in this case, we're part of two groups.
I like that. I like it. So let's start with a little icebreaker question. And I would ask you, what is one small thing that most people don't know about you?
All right, a small thing most people don't know about me. When I was little, I loved to juggle. My brother Andrew someone had taught him to juggle, and he's like, there's no way you're going to learn on your own. Someone has to teach you. And I bought a book called Juggling for Dummies, and I taught myself how to juggle. And I used to love juggling. In fact, at one point I was at summer camp and I had my own little class within the camp where I taught other kids how to do it. So I still know how to juggle, although I don't do it nearly as much as I used to. But most people don't know that I know how to do that.
You have a hidden gift.
We all do, right?
I don't know. I don't think I could juggle to save my life, but that's pretty awesome. I like it. So you're a physician. You're a hospice physician. I want to know, what drew you into working in end-of-life care as a doctor?
So I was destined for hospice care. My father died when I was 7 years old. He had a brain aneurysm and he died suddenly. And back then, partially because he died quickly, but also no one really knew what to say to us. No one knew what to tell us. No one knew really how to be with us. So this was very present in my mind. As I grew older, I wanted to be a lot like my dad's, and my dad was a doctor, so I wanted to be a doctor too. When I got into medical school, I remember going for my first week, and the first patient I ever saw was a hospice patient. I signed up to volunteer at the inpatient hospice at Northwestern University. So I immediately knew that this was something that I felt close to. I volunteered for a number of years while I was a first and second year medical student. As time went on, I settled on general internal medicine and became a general practitioner. And I kind of let it go to the wayside for a number of years. But eventually I was doing so much geriatrics and so much end-of-life care, and I was good at it and I understood it. And so it kind of sucked me back into the field.
It's sort of a natural segue, though, isn't it? I mean, it's dovetailed. Gerontologists, end-of-life care, all of that sort of works together, or we should anyway.
For sure. And so I was taking care of people in the last few years of life, and it was very normal for me to have this conversation with them and their families and say, look, things aren't getting better. And there is a point where medical care, specifically aggressive medical care, is actually more harmful than good. And so my ability to have that conversation from the outset just made it much easier for me to take care of these patients and to align better with their sense of dignity and what they wanted at the end of life. And I was taking care of one of these patients actually, and I had called hospice to see my patient, and I had started the Dilaudid drip and the lorazepam, and I was managing their secretions, and the hospice nurse came and said, well, you kind of don't need us, do you? And I said, oh, well, no. It's really helpful in all the services and the pastoral care and the social work, and this is so great. And the hospice nurse looked at me and said, you should really come work with us. And that was the first time I ever considered doing hospice work, although it had become part of my practice of general medicine anyway. So that gave me the reason to formally get involved. And I started as a hospice medical director. And of course, a lot of us doctors, when we didn't grow up and weren't trained in hospice, we learn a lot of it on the go. We learn a lot of our hospice medicine from our hospice nurses and our hospice CNAs who are wise and have years of taking care of patients and often know exactly what those patients need. And so it was a great intro into the field. And I'm very thankful for this nurse who happened to kind of look at me and say, hey, why aren't you working with us?
Yeah, you were already a hospice physician. I've known a lot of nurses that were like that were able to teach and were empathic and understood the way the philosophy worked. And I would tell them, you're already a hospice nurse. You just need to go find a job where you can fit in. I absolutely love it that you sang out hospice CNAs, that you are an advocate for their value, because we really undervalue and under-recognize the work that hospice CNAs do. Those folks have the most intimate, most frequent contact with our patients. Patients tell them stuff that they won't tell their nurses.
We actually have a hospice CNA. We have a few of the hospice CNAs, and they're known when patients are starting the process of dying. We often send these CNAs because they go and they give the patient a bath and they hand bathe them. And I swear a lot of them die very shortly thereafter. There's just something about the warmth and the closeness. And we talk about medicines and morphine and Ativan, all these wonderful tools we have in hospice. And yet it's the laying on of hands. It's that last bath, that last bit of dignity that these people are allowed to die comfortably, but also in a sense, die clean and coddled. It's just an amazing thing. And our CNAs devote so much of their heart and their energy and their time to this. I'm lucky in the sense that as the doctor, I get to make decisions, give medications, help with clinical care. But my real job is not just to the patients. Actually, a lot of my job is to the nurses, chaplains, social workers, and CNAs, because they are doing the moment-to-moment, really difficult work and care. And so my job is to be right there by text, giving them the orders, supporting them in what they need, because they are giving that moment-to-moment difficult care. And so I love practicing hospice. I'll do it as long as I possibly can, because I'm really actually supporting that other group of people who's doing the really hard emotional work.
Well, and that's not an easy thing for a physician. You really do have to stay available. And we're talking about 24/7 when it's your turn. So I want to ask you something, Jordan. When we think about the role of the hospice physician, a lot of agencies across the United States don't have a full-time hospice doctor, right? A lot of their doctors are in private practice, or they're working in other areas, and then, part-time, they also serve as medical director for a hospice agency. So sometimes it seems like the doctor is a little bit disconnected or disengaged from the group. Do you ever find yourself feeling a little bit isolated in the compassion fatigue that you feel when you are working with hospice patients?
It's interesting you bring that up. Hospice started in the United States in the 70s and 80s, and often was volunteer, and it often was nurse-led or even lay people-led. And many times they didn't even have a doctor involved, or very loosely involved. Now, as hospice became part of the Medicare program, you needed physicians to actually certify patients that they're hospice appropriate, that they could stay on hospice, and to recertify patients every certain amount of time. So the doctor actually was pulled in almost for administrative reasons. The interesting place we're in now is we have a lot of these hospice nurses and CNAs who've been in hospice for so long. A lot of the times, especially at the beginning of my career, the hospice nurse would call and say, "This is what you need to do." And that's because they had been practicing hospice medicine for so long with their patients that they ultimately knew, in a sense, I'm actually protected from the compassion fatigue because I'm not the front line. Often I'm called in when a specific symptom is difficult to control, or then there's a particular ethical issue, and then I'll come in and we'll do a family meeting and we'll do all those kind of things and evaluate the patient. But being the doctor, I don't have to be there moment to moment the way the nurses or CNAs do. And I think I'm actually shielded and protected from some of that fatigue. In some ways, I think I have one of the easiest jobs on the team. And one of the reasons I really love hospice is because everywhere else you go, the doctor is the top of the team and everything flows from there. In hospice, we are all really equals, in my opinion. And so what that social worker is doing when they come in and they ease a family suffering or help them plan where a patient is going to spend their last days, or when the CNA comes in and gives a bath, or when the nurse comes in and gets the comfort kit ready. I mean, the roles we all play equally affect people's lives. And so for me, it's just a very different way to practice medicine. It's a lot more collaborative. In a sense, all the pressure is taken off of me and it's put on the team. We're now a team of people and we all have a role to play. And I actually find that very comforting. And so I think I have less actual fatigue because I'm protected in some ways.
It's a really unique structure. So for anybody listening who doesn't really know anything about the structure in hospice, we call it an interdisciplinary team or a multidisciplinary team. And it's across the board. There's no hierarchy with the physician at top and then the nurse, social worker, chaplain, and the aide. It doesn't work that way. For us, it is across the board because each person, each discipline brings that specific set of skills that we just can't do without. It's like the aide. I was always taught that being clean is part of being comfortable. So medicines, life review, emotional support, bereavement support, and being clean, all of those things were equal. There was never a hierarchy. So it's just an amazing system, an amazing structure that, in my opinion, makes hospice very special, makes it very unique, and that's what makes it successful. So you're a podcaster, like I am. You have a podcast called Earn and Invest. And before people decide that they don't want to listen to that because nobody likes to talk about money, but it is about managing money. And you talk about serious illness and how it can be impacted by financial burden. Because we know that financial burden of caregiving and serious illness is very real and very big. How have you seen patients and families be impacted financially by serious illness and terminal illness?
Well, it's funny. We talk about unexpected financial catastrophe, and we call those black swan events, right? So something, a nuclear war, these horrible things that could happen that could ruin all of our finances. What we don't talk about is what I call white swan events. These are actually expected catastrophes, things that happen to a lot of us and yet can have a major financial impact. Divorce is a big one, right? A health scare is another one, right? You break your leg and you don't have health insurance, and all of a sudden you're spending thousands and thousands of dollars on healthcare and an operation. Well, end-of-life care is another one of those things that's a white swan event. It can be a financial catastrophe. On the other hand, it's something that we all should expect we're going to have to deal with. In fact, they've done studies that show that people tend to spend around $150,000, $200,000 in their last year or two of life, or it's certainly possible if people need a little bit more aggressive types of care. So it's something we have to risk modify or risk mitigate for. It's something we have to think about when we're earlier on in our careers and when we're looking at what enough means to us. And I'm talking about financially enough. What's enough money to live off of? What's enough money to retire? Part of that calculation needs to be what's enough to cover financial catastrophes, because a lot of us are going to face those. A lot of us may need long-term care. A lot of us may have hospitalizations at the end of life. We might need to hire caregivers. So it's something we need to start building into our financial model earlier. You know, back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, you could buy long-term care insurance and the premiums weren't so horrible that you could actually protect yourself a little bit against the cost of end of life or even disability type care. Nowadays, long-term care insurance is just a lot more cost prohibitive. And so we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about how to have enough money left and have a bucket of savings or a bucket of investments that may help us when we are in these phases. So what I love to say is when people are dying, they don't think about things like, boy, I wish I made more money. They don't regret that they didn't spend more hours at the job. But that last year or two of life, you are going to possibly be impacted by high spending needs. And so you will at least contemplate, did I save enough and was I careful enough? Because end-of-life care, we call hospice care, right, 6 months or less, but palliative care, which really can last a few years before death, can be expensive and you can require a lot of help. And so we have to be thoughtful about saving and investing for that future, as well as just for basic retirement and fun and joy and living and all those other things that are a little bit more fun to think about.
So I've read studies that when it comes to Alzheimer's and dementia patients, those folks are the ones who are racking up the medical bills in that last year of life, which is a little bit counterintuitive, right? We know that in hospice, a lot of people in healthcare don't know that, and the financial burden of taking care of someone with Alzheimer's or dementia or Parkinson's, those neurological diseases, that disease trajectory is so much longer. So that financial caregiving burden becomes much more elongated. Tell me that figure again. In that last year of life, how much did you say?
Around $150,000 to $200,000. So they've done studies. So we know that people spend a lot in that last year or two. And as you were saying, it's very true. You know, the trajectory for general Alzheimer's from onset of first symptoms to death can be 10 years or more. Mm-hmm. And so not only do you have financial fatigue, but you generally have caregiver fatigue. So sometimes there are spouses and family who are taking care of these patients for 8 to 10 years. And when they get to that last year or two of life, they are overwhelmed and they need to hire help because they've been there 24/7 for the last bunch of years. And so there's just, it's complicated. And we're so good nowadays at keeping people alive, right? We've gotten really good at chronic disease management, but that has economic consequences.
It does. It does. And not just for the patient or the person with the diagnosis, but for the family members, not necessarily just the spouse or the partner, but children that feel like they need to contribute financially to help them get through it.
And not just contributing financially, also contributing in caregiving. So days lost at work. For instance, my wife just helped her parents move into a condo from their house, and she had to take 3 months of FMLA, 3 months of lost wages, to get her parents settled. And thankfully we were lucky, we could manage that, and we could allow for her not to get paid for 3 months to go do what she needed to do. But I can't imagine if we were, living hand to mouth, what that would have done to us.
Well, you're right. There's so many different things other than just hands-on caregiving, which is physically taxing in and of itself. I think it's something like 36% of caregivers that are over 70 die before their loved one does. That impact. And I have also seen caregivers that were hesitant to get help, paid help in the home for their loved one because they were trying to consider what the future would be after the loved one dies. How am I going to live? Am I going to be able to stay where I am and pay my own bills? So they're trying to be as conservative as possible, and that has its own consequences.
Yeah, these are real-time worries, and all the reason more to be thoughtful about your finances at an early age, which is easy to say, not necessarily easy to do. But we talk about that a lot on Earn and Invest, this idea of how can you start to organize and structure your finances to support your possible needs, your family's possible needs in the future.
But isn't that a little bit like advanced care planning? None of that seems real. Right? When you're in your 20s, you don't think so much about retirement. You don't think so much about old age or illness or long-term care. Same thing with your advanced care planning. You're 7 feet tall and bulletproof. My death, I'm going to live another 50 years. So why do I even need to make plans or even have those discussions now?
It's interesting. And I thought about this a lot in my book, Taking Stock. I think advanced care planning, especially when we talk about it with elderly patients or hospice patients, we're talking about kind of what they're going to want for themselves when they get to that place. But part of advanced care planning, too, is this idea of making sure you can live the life you want to live. And so my argument often is that we should start thinking about advanced care planning at a very young age, not to figure out what kind of care we're going to want when we can't do things anymore, but more to get our life in order so that we're going to be ready for those later stages of life. So when we're young, yes, you don't want to think about how am I going to pay for my nursing home when I'm 70, but you might want to start thinking about what kind of things do I want to accomplish, because there'll be a time in life that I can't accomplish those things. And how can I start living a little bit more of a purposeful life now so that when I get to those places where maybe I need care, maybe I can't accomplish the things I want to accomplish, I have less regrets and I'm more ready for them. So I almost feel like we should use advanced care planning when we're really talking about how we build a purposeful life, even starting at a young age, because we should really be thinking about this idea that life is finite. And so there's no better time than today to start thinking about those important things.
Yeah, it's those life lessons and conversations we should be having way upstream from where we have them now. So let's talk about your book, Taking Stock. In the book, you are writing about how people with terminal illness can teach the living about money and life. Anybody who works in hospice knows that we learn more from our patients than we ever teach them. It's just the natural flow of being close to somebody and companioning them as they walk to the end of their lives. What are the biggest lessons that you have learned from your patients?
So let me give you a little bit of background. I was a practicing physician and I started burning out in medicine. And I started looking for a way out of practice. I was like, I've had it. I've done enough. This was before I actually got deeper into hospice work. And I went down the rabbit hole of personal finance and learned about financial independence and realized at some level that I had saved up money and I invested and I owned property. I did all these things that I probably could stop working and would be just fine. Now, that was the answer to what do I do about this job that was burning me out, but it actually caused a little bit of a panic and anxiety attack because I had no idea who I was. I had never thought about life, my identity, my purpose outside of medicine. And so I started to think very deeply about these things. I started to write about personal finance because that was the thing that was giving me this freedom to do whatever I wanted with my life. Eventually, that led to a blog and the Earn and Invest podcast. And so I was asking all these next level questions about finances. Here I am in this position where I found I have enough money. I could leave medicine, which is stressing me out. But what do I do with my life? And what does a purposeful life look like? And I was talking to all these financial experts and interviewing them. And the truth of the matter is, a lot of times they were struggling just like I was. What's purposeful? What is my best identity? How do I live a good life? And by this time, I had transitioned mostly out of medicine and stuck with the one part of medicine I really loved, which was my hospice work. And I started realizing my hospice patients were answering all those questions that I couldn't quite answer with my financial podcast. They were starting to really talk about these things that were important in life, going past the money and looking at who am I and what do I want to be? The truth of the matter is, when a patient is given a hospice diagnosis, it's a very specific lens on their life. And it really pushes away societal expectations and even family and personal expectations. And for once, people really get to look at themselves, hopefully, and say, what was important to me? What did I accomplish? What didn't I accomplish? If I have a few months left, what would I like to accomplish? And it was a very clear lens. And often I found that those patients thought less about things like money and working and whether I made it to a certain salary or whether I made it to a certain promotion or not. But often what they really regretted is that they never had the energy, courage, or time to do these certain things in their lives that were important to them. And for every person, that's very different, right? So for one person, that might be writing a book. For another person, it might be a hobby. For another person, it might be building a house. For another person, it might be that relationship that went astray 20 or 30 years ago and they never worked on fixing it. So for all of us, it's very different. But the lens that the dying were using were saying, if I could go back and get that time all over again, how would I now spend it? What would I concentrate on? And taking that knowledge and then bringing it into the financial arena where we're building these financial lives, we're trying to do all the right money moves to free up our time and our emotions and our energy. But a lot of times we don't have that clarity of dying patients about what's important to us. And so, as you know, if we can get a dying patient comfortable and we can get their symptoms controlled and we can get them in a safe environment, a lot of times someone in the team, whether that be a nurse or a social worker or a chaplain or sometimes even a doctor, will sit down and work through a life review, a structured series of questions where we talk about their lives and what was important and what wasn't important and what were those sentinel events and what do they regret and what do they hope to accomplish in whatever future they have. And it started to hit me that a lot of these people I was talking to about their financial lives should be doing these same life reviews way before they're getting a hospice diagnosis. They should be really thinking not how much money can I make or how do I make the most money, but more importantly, what can that money give me the freedom to pursue? What are those things that are deeply important to me? And so I really found that the dying gave me that clarity that I had never had when I was having just isolated financial conversations.
It's interesting that the financial should be part of the end of life review and philosophy. It just seems such a mix because what we know about end of life care and about hospice is it's a science and an art all at the same time. We take care of patients with medical care, with nursing care, and yet we are still taking care of their spirits and their relationships and their connections. It's such a blend of this whole person care. And I think we forget to put the financial piece in there because let's face it, money makes the world go round, right? It's how we feed ourselves. It's how we feed our families. But you're right. I have never had a hospice patient that came to me and said, I wish that I had gone for this particular promotion.
Yeah.
Yeah. The regrets are all about how did I spend my time, connection, relationships, things I didn't pursue, dreams that I had. Yeah.
And we all have those things. And so, you know, the purpose of the life review is not to fix a person's misgivings, right? But we do know that when people go through the life review, they hopefully find some peace in their past, but also if there are things lacking, that they also might have a short period of time to right some wrongs or at least come to peace with those other things. Maybe they can call that relative that it's been 10 years and say their goodbyes and do those kind of things. So that's like the last minute save. And so I love the life review because even in hospice, even with only 6 months left, we sometimes can help people with those last minute saves. We can bring them a modicum of peace about something that is unresolved in their life. what I'm hoping is that we can start taking these kind of messages to younger people so that we don't need last minute saves, right? So that instead we can have them work on these things way before they're near end of life. But if you're going to work on purpose and identity and not having regrets early on in life, you've got to build a financial framework that allows that.
Right.
And that's why I kind of tie some of that wisdom of the end of life with the financial workings of much younger people, because the finances, the money does make the world go around. And it's an incredibly powerful tool to actually start working on those things that a life review can uncover. And that's what I think really ties the financial with the life review and even with the wisdom of the end of life.
I like the idea of starting earlier. It's so hard to get people to have those conversations. Even people my age, I'm almost 60. I would never, ever have had those conversations when I was in my 20s. Now, I would talk about the financial piece, right? Because I had been brought up, that was always a conversation in my household, to be financially independent, stay out of debt, et cetera, build wealth. But how that would impact the later years in my life and what would be quality of life and how I would finance that was never a conversation at our dinner table.
Well, let's be honest, like the financial conversation or even the professional conversation, talking about what you want to do with your life or your profession, et cetera, those are really easy conversations in a sense. And the reason why we like to talk about money instead of life review and regrets of being on our deathbed is we really hate this idea that life is finite. And we do almost anything we can to avoid thinking about that. So much easier than having this huge conversation about purpose, identity, who am I, and what would I regret if I didn't get to accomplish? Because again, that is just flashing in our face that life is finite. And if you don't start doing things now, you might never. It's much easier to focus on the mirage of things we think are important, like job promotions, like money in a sense. We use it as a mirage to actually protect us from doing some of the really harder work. And the truth of the matter is, as hard as it is to accumulate enough money to call yourself financially independent, the steps are really clear and knowable and learnable. As hard as getting that next promotion or being a partner in your firm is, those steps are definable. But ask someone, what's your sense of purpose and identity in this world? What's purpose mean to you? And that's a really hard question without definable answers. We do almost anything we can to avoid those difficult conversations, that really difficult work.
Right. So let's get a little bit personal. Since we're talking about life review and regrets and end of life and advanced care plan conversations, let's talk about your personal advanced care plan. What are 3 components of your advanced care plan?
So one of the wonderful things about doing some of this work and writing this book is I've had a lot of time to think about things that I would regret lying on my deathbed and start working on them now. So thankfully, I think my life review will hopefully, fingers crossed, feel very good. But some advanced care thoughts for me. I love eating. So I want part of my advanced care plan that I can eat whatever I want. I don't care what my blood sugar is. I don't care what my blood pressure is, especially when I get to the point where I'm getting close to end of life. I don't care what my diet is. Just feed me whatever I want. Right. So that's first and foremost.
Right.
2, I think my ethos is quality over quantity. So I think when it comes to end of life care decisions for me, my family members and loved ones should really look at quality more than quantity. I'm not worried, feeling like I've done some of the life review work, even at the age of 50. I feel pretty at peace with the idea that, like my father who died suddenly at 40, I could die at any time. And I've tried to build a life that I'm ready for that. So if I get a little bit less time, I'd rather focus on being comfortable. And I think last but not least, I'm a pretty happy person, so I think as long as I cognitively am with it, I'm fine with advanced care plans that keep me alive as long as I can think and mentate and contemplate things. I think if I lose cognitive function, then to me that would become a life a lot less worth living. So I think part of my advanced care plan is definitely like if my cognition is affected, less aggressive care should be given.
So when you think about quality versus quantity, quality of life versus the length of time that you're given with your healthcare and your hospice support, you've embraced a premise that a lot of people do not understand, and they come into hospice care having to switch mindsets. And of course, working in hospice and working with seriously ill and terminally ill patients, you've been given a leg up, right? You already have an understanding of what that's like. But most of our patients come to us and they are switching one light switch off and having to turn on another one that feels very unnatural. Very unnatural. It's all about time. How much time can you give me? I'm sure as a doctor, you've had that question asked of you.
Yes, multiple times. And often, what I always tell people is there is a precipice in our healthcare system that once you go over, aggressive healthcare tends to be more harmful than helpful. And so I really have these conversations with patients and especially family, that quantity versus quality, because in some ways our healthcare system can be like a runaway train. And once it gets a lot of steam, it's hard to slow it down. And so I really think it's important to have those conversations with people. And certainly having the quote unquote hospice talk, I've used very similar verbiage because I think it's important that people realize that we can often prolong life, but it can be in a either painful or for what some people might consider an undignified way. And so we got to really talk about dignity and what that means. And often, not always, but often I find when people really understand the choices, to them, dignity is more about quality of life than quantity, mostly. Now, not everyone, but mostly.
I think once people begin to examine and reflect on that, that's what they determine for themselves. So, Jordan, tell my listeners how they can find your podcast, Earn and Invest.
So I always say there's just one way to get in touch with all the content I produce, right? So if you go to jordangrummett.com, JORDANGRUMET.com, you can find out about the book, Taking Stock, order it there. But I've also really created content in three main ways. The first was a blog about medicine called In My Humble Opinion. I actually wrote it for about 15 years. It's about my experiences of being a doctor. So the link is there at jordangrummett.com. I also started a financial blog called Diversify. Links there. And what I do most of my time now is the Earn and Invest podcast, which you can find a link at jordangrummett.com or just earnandinvest.com. Anywhere where you listen to podcasts, you can look it up.
Awesome. So is your book, Taking Stock, is it available on Amazon, Indie Books? Where can they find that other than your website?
Yeah, so you can pretty much find it wherever you find books online and in select bookstores. I think it's in about a third of the Barnes & Nobles in the U.S. and a bunch of smaller and independent bookstores also.
Awesome. Well, I'll have links to everything in the show notes so they can connect with you. Jordan, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. It's a little bit unusual. It's that marrying of the practical and the spiritual, the whole body care, which includes mind, body, spirit. So you have to look at the financial as well as all the medical stuff. So I thank you for the work that you're doing. I love it and so glad to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure.
So I think Jordan's medical school experience was a little bit different because he chose to work as a hospice volunteer and he felt like that was a good fit for him. I think he's got some natural gifts and intuitively he realized this was where he needed to be. And so he made his way professionally to work with a hospice team. He's an advocate for the work of the hospice team. And like I said, especially those CNAs, wonderful, wonderful. Working as a hospice medical director, he realizes that he has the easiest job, is what he says. I don't know that that's true. I've seen hospice doctors that helped us troubleshoot patients that were having significant challenges with their symptoms, just wonderfully available to the nursing staff and doing a lot of education with us as well. So on his podcast, Earn and Invest, he talks about white swan events. So not black swan events that are catastrophic, but white swan events that can be financially catastrophic for people. And serious illness is one of those things. End-of-life care can be expensive. Saving and investing is important so that you can mitigate that financial risk at end of life. So when he talks about finances and how it is significant during a serious illness and end of life, he also talks about finding meaning and finding purpose. And a lot of that he got from his patients and their families. See, this is what I always say about hospice. We learn and get so much more from our patients than we ever teach or give them. And you talk to any hospice person, they will tell you that same thing. So, Jordan has generously donated 5 copies of his book, Taking Stock, to us, and we want to share them with you, our listeners. So, here's how you can get a book. Go into Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. After you leave the review, send me an email to host@theheartofhospice.com and let me know that you left a review. You're going to receive a personal response. I'm going to go in and check and make sure I see your review, and then I'm going to check back with you, get a mailing address for you, and I'm going to send you one of Jordan's books. So go to Apple Podcasts. Scroll all the way down to the end of our podcast. You'll see at the very bottom, underneath all our episodes, a place where you can leave a review. And remember, a rating isn't good enough because it won't have your name on it. But if you leave a review, it'll have your name on it and we'll know that it's yours. So leave us a review and get one of Jordan's books. Be sure to catch the next episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast. You can find more episodes on theheartofhospice.com, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can connect with the Heart of Hospice on Facebook and Instagram, and send your questions or comments to me by email to host@theheartofhospice.com. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.